A woman walks into a five-star restaurant wearing a plain beige dress and gets mocked by the manager for asking about a $300 bottle of wine. But 24 hours later, she owns the place, and what she does next, nobody saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you'll want to remember. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? And if you've ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person, hit subscribe, because this one will stay with you. It was just an ordinary Tuesday evening in Washington, D.C. But for Diana Winters, it might as well have been the most important night of her life. The late spring air was cool against her skin as she stepped out of the taxi, the hem of her modest beige dress fluttering gently around her calves. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, no designer handbag dangling from her arm, no towering stilettos, no glittering necklace to catch the eye. Just a simple woman in her mid-40s, eyes calm, shoulders square, walking toward a building that gleamed like a temple of old money and privilege. The Arlington. To the uninitiated, it was just another fine dining establishment. But to those in the know, it was the crown jewel of elite gastronomy in the capital, an invitation-only wine list, a waiting list for Friday nights that stretched back months, and a clientele that included everyone from foreign dignitaries to Fortune 500 CEOs. Every polished brass handle, every glimmering crystal chandelier whispered a quiet but unmistakable message: if you don't belong, you'll know it the second you walk in. And Diana, by all appearances, she did not belong. She paused outside the tall glass doors, hands smoothing the front of her dress as if trying to press down the weight of her own nerves. Inside, she could see servers gliding between white-clothed tables, a jazz quartet playing something low and golden, the kind of music that cost hundreds of dollars per hour and wasn't even meant to be heard. Just felt, for a brief moment, she caught her own reflection in the glass, a woman of experience, not extravagance, and yet she whispered to herself, "You can do this." 3 weeks earlier, her life had turned on a dime. She'd been sitting in her cramped home office, surrounded by food cost spreadsheets and handwritten notes on supplier reliability. When the call came, it was a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Edward Blackwood's lawyer. Edward, the culinary legend, the man who'd built an empire on taste, discipline, and quiet generosity. She'd met him only once, 5 years ago, at a chef's summit in Chicago. She remembered it well because it was the only time in her career she'd felt truly seen by someone at his level. He'd shaken her hand, asked about her sauces, and then, when the flashier chefs tried to pull him away, he'd stayed and talked to her about lentils and lemon zest, just her. And now, Edward was gone. Cancer. The lawyer had said, slow, painful, private, but before he passed, he left one instruction to offer Diana Winters the chance to buy the Arlington. She'd thought it was a prank. Then the paperwork arrived, the legal details, the transfer process, the signatures. It was all real, and Edward had insisted that the announcement be delayed. Delayed, no press release, no grand unveiling, just a quiet transition. He trusted her to learn the place before claiming it, to observe, to understand. So here she was, not as the new owner, but as a customer. And not just any customer, but one completely stripped of social armor. No business attire, no name-drop introductions, no assistant calling ahead. She wanted the raw truth of this place. She wanted to see how her staff, soon to be her staff, treated someone who had no power. As she stepped through the doors, the temperature dropped slightly, a mix of air conditioning and quiet judgment. The maitre d' stood behind his podium, tall and thin like a candlestick, every inch of him crisply ironed and expressionless. His eyes flicked over her in an instant, the way a scanner reads a barcode. Beige dress, no jewelry, no partner. "Good evening," he said, with the kind of smile that had been practiced into perfection. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Diana replied, evenly. "Winters, party of one." The maitre d' consulted his ledger. There was a pause, a flicker of surprise that he quickly buried beneath a nod. Ah, yeah. Ms. Winners. He paused again. We don't often get solo diners at the Arlington. There it was. Diana gave a polite smile. I've heard good things. Thought I'd treat myself. He didn't respond, just gestured toward a young hostess who materialized silently beside her. Her uniform so sharp it looked like it could cut glass. Melissa will take you to your table. As they walked through the dining room, Diana felt the gaze of the room shift subtle, polite, but very real. Other diners barely tilted their heads, just enough to mark her passing. This wasn't the kind of place where people stared. It was where people noted. Melissa led her to a small table near the kitchen doors. It wasn't insulting, exactly. But it wasn't prime real estate either. Not near the windows, not beneath the chandeliers, just convenient for service. Out of the way, out of sight. Your server will be with you shortly, Melissa said, placing a thick leather-bound menu on the table and vanishing just as quickly. Diana sat, breathing in the scents around her truffle oil, saffron, aged beef. She wasn't offended. She wasn't even surprised. She was documenting every second, every interaction, every unspoken rule of this place. Minutes passed before a young man approached. He wore a pressed black vest and a name tag that read Ryan. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good evening. Ma'am, I'm Ryan. I'll be your server tonight. Can I get you started with something to drink? Yes, she said. Your house bourbon? Neat. His eyebrows lifted just slightly, a flicker of surprise. Of course. Ma'am, she watched him walk away, noting how he moved differently between tables. To the older couple celebrating an anniversary, he bowed slightly, his voice warm and congratulatory. To the table of businessmen with Rolexes and loosened ties, he laughed too loudly. With her, he was restrained. And then she saw him, Victor, the general manager. She knew it had to be him before she heard anyone say his name. He wore a silver suit that shimmered slightly beneath the lights, and he glided between tables like a politician at a fundraiser. With each stop, his face changed affectionate for the elderly, reverent for the powerful, fawning for the famous. But with her, he didn't stop, just glanced once, briefly, and moved on. It was perfect. Diana leaned back slightly, sipping her bourbon when it arrived. The taste smooth, smoky, with a bite at the end, just like this place. She had no illusions. Places like the Arlington didn't just serve food, they served validation. They told people they mattered, that they were worthy. And that's why this moment at this first hour, this unremarkable beige dress, this underwhelmed server, and this dismissive manager was more important than any grand opening or media blitz could ever be. Because when the truth comes out, when people find out who she really is, when the staff realizes they judge the future of this restaurant based on her shoes, her dress, and the fact that she sat alone, that's when the real story begins. The server returned with Diana's bourbon, placing it gently before her with a polite nod, but still without the warmth she had seen him offer to other tables. Let me know when you're ready to order, Ryan said, then disappeared into the rhythm of the room again. Diana lifted the glass, letting it rest near her lips for a moment before taking a sip, an intentional pause to soak in the surroundings. Her seat, tucked just out of the spotlight, gave her an unfiltered view of the inner workings of the restaurant, the side glances between staff, the cues exchanged with subtle gestures, the hierarchy invisible to the untrained eye, but glaring to someone like her. She watched Melissa, the hostess who had shown her to her table, usher in a new couple. They were young, early 30s maybe, but the woman carried a designer purse and the man wore a watch that cost more than Diana's car. As soon as Melissa saw them, her posture changed, straighter, more reverent. She led them not to a table by the kitchen doors, but to a cozy booth near the front. Beneath the softest lights and within clear sight of the main floor, the contrast wasn't just obvious, it was calculated. Diana turned her eyes back to her table, unfolding the menu and scanning the options with the air of a true guest, not a potential investor, not a future owner, just a woman deciding what she wanted to eat. But each item, Each wine pairing, each descriptor was processed through a different lens, a lens of experience, of memory, of value. Edward had always believed food was an invitation. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about philosophy. Was that still true here? As she skimmed through the tasting menu, she noticed a subtle shift in wording. Terms like exclusive and elevated had replaced the words Edward used to favor seasonal, sourced, inspired. The dishes were ornate. Yeah, the wine pairing's impressive, but something in the tone felt colder, more transactional, less soul. She placed the menu down just as Ryan returned. Have you decided? Ma'am, I'd like to try the chef's tasting menu with the wine pairings. Please, she said, her voice composed. He blinked. Of course, that's an excellent choice. There was a beat too long before he added. It's a 7-course menu with premium pairings. Just so you're aware, the suggestion wasn't lost on her. The implication was soft but clear. Are you sure you can afford that? Sounds perfect, Diana replied. Folding her hands neatly on the table, Ryan gave a courteous smile and left to place her order. Not long after, a sommelier, though not the head one, she noted approached with the first pour. He offered a brief explanation of the white wine that would accompany the amuse-bouche, recited with well-rehearsed flair, but not with much passion. As he poured, Diana asked softly, "Does the chef still design the menu himself?" There was a flicker of hesitation. Chef Harrington oversees it. Yes, though Mr. Remington is very involved in the final decisions. Mr. Remington. Victor. Diana gave a slight nod, filing the information away. When the amuse-bouche arrived moments later, a single spoonful of something delicate and citrus-forward, she tasted it slowly. The execution was beautiful, but it felt more like performance than expression. It was a detail only someone who had built menus for years could notice. The plate was meant to impress, not connect. Between the first and second course, Victor finally made his way to her table. She noticed the way he approached, deliberate, slow, theatrical. He wasn't visiting her table out of genuine interest. He was checking in on the anomaly, the unaccompanied woman in the beige dress who had just ordered the most expensive menu in the house. "Good evening," he said, with that same thin smile. "I'm Victor Remington, General Manager. I hope you're enjoying your experience so far." Diana met his gaze. Very much. The amuse-bouche was delicate, but thoughtful, and the wine was a lovely match. Victor nodded, eyes flicking over her as if searching for something that didn't belong. "The chef's tasting menu is one of our proudest offerings, though I should note, the wine pairings include a few rare vintages. They're curated quite intentionally." A pause. "Was that another warning? I appreciate the intentionality," she said calmly. "Of course," Victor replied. "Please let me know if you need anything else. Within reason, of course." He left with the air of someone who believed he'd just done a favor. Diana watched him as he moved across the room, his posture shifting as he approached a party of 3 men in tailored blazers. Laughter, backpats, personal anecdotes followed. The difference in energy was glaring. The second course arrived, a scallop perfectly seared, placed atop a bed of microgreens, and drizzled with a truffle reduction. Again, the flavors were technically excellent, but as she took her first bite, Diana couldn't help but remember Edward's scallops from years past. Simple, sweet, finished with just a hint of citrus oil, and served with a story about the fishermen who caught them. This dish beautiful, but sterile. She continued through the courses, taking her time, letting the experience wash over her like an investigation. Ryan loosened slightly over time, especially when she asked about the ingredients in the risotto or the wine region for the Syrah. He began to sense that she wasn't just another guest. She was paying attention, deeply, and Diana, in return, learned more through what wasn't said. The forced smiles, the rushed explanations when larger parties demanded service, the fleeting looks between staff members when Victor passed by. This wasn't just a restaurant running cold, it was a restaurant running scared. By the 5th course, she began to understand the rhythm of the place, the power dynamics, the pressure. She also began to suspect that Victor wasn't just a snob, he was a manipulator. The staff didn't just defer to him, they deferred out of caution, self-preservation. Melissa, in particular, looked like she walked on eggshells every time he entered the room. The sixth course, a lamb loin with an elegant red wine reduction, was served by Ryan again. "Would you like to know more about the pairing?" he asked this time. A little more engaged. "I would, especially the Bordeaux." "It's exceptional," Ryan smiled. This time genuinely. "It's a rare one. We only serve it by pairing. It's not available by bottle for takeout." "Shame," she said. "It's the best thing I've tasted tonight." As he walked away, Diana felt a quiet satisfaction building not from the food, but from the pieces falling into place. This was more than mismanagement. There was a culture issue here, a leadership issue, and beneath it all, maybe something darker. And then came the noise. A sudden spike in energy near the entrance as four men entered, laughing, one of them loud enough to echo across the polished floors. Victor rushed to greet them like a man welcoming royalty, Senator Williams. "What an unexpected pleasure," he announced to the room. Suddenly, the dynamic of the space changed. Servers were redirected. Tables were reset. Champagne arrived without being ordered. Diana watched her own server pulled away to handle glasses for the senator's party. Abandoning her mid-conversation, she wasn't offended. She was fascinated. Victor orbited the senator's table like a planet around a sun, laughing, topping off drinks, clapping backs. Meanwhile, the flow of the restaurant began to falter. Other tables were neglected. Timing slipped. Staff hustled. But the balance was off. Diana sipped her final wine slowly, choosing not to rush through dessert, which arrived with a bit less flair than the earlier courses. A deconstructed chocolate souffle with vanilla bean ice cream, delicious, but rushed. She waited until Ryan returned to ask for the check. He brought it quickly but looked winded, as if he'd just run a marathon. "Everything was excellent," she said kindly. "I'd love to speak to the sommelier before I leave if he's available. I had a question about the Bordeaux." Ryan hesitated. I'll ask. He's currently attending to the senator's table." "Of course," she said. "I understand." But that moment was the final thread. She watched Ryan walk away, watched Victor intercept him again, whisper something harsh into his ear, and watched Ryan's shoulders slump. And that's when she knew. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be returning to the Arlington. Tomorrow, she'd be returning as its owner. As the evening wore on, the subtle chill of the restaurant's curated atmosphere seemed to thicken around Diana like a second skin. The more she observed, the more the weight of invisible hierarchies bore down on the space. It was all in the little things, the way plates clinked slightly louder when served to solo diners, the tightened faces of staff when Victor walked by, the carefully orchestrated symphony of perfection that left no room for real warmth. The deeper Diana sat in it, the more she saw through the polished veneer. By the time she reached the final course, the clamor from the senator's table had grown louder. Laughter echoed across the restaurant, and Victor's voice, now syrupy and theatrical, carried above the soft jazz in clipped bursts of approval. Diana finished the last spoonful of her dessert and set down her spoon quietly. Across the room, she noticed a few other diners shifting uncomfortably. Even here, among the power players and socialites, the performative indulgence had become just a little too much. She requested the bill once more, and Ryan, clearly stretched thin, reappeared with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry for the delay. Ma'am, we're short-staffed tonight," he murmured, though they both knew that wasn't true. His bow tie, once perfectly knotted, now sat slightly askew. "It's quite all right," Diana said. "You've been very attentive. I do have one last request, though, about that Bordeaux with the lamb. I'd love to know if it's available by the bottle." Ryan's hesitation this time was more visible. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, "Let me check with Mr. Remington." Diana nodded, watching him disappear again into the invisible labyrinth of restaurant politics. Moments later, Victor emerged instead, his smile all polish and edge. His voice was louder than necessary, clearly meant for nearby tables to hear. "Madam," he began with exaggerated civility, "I understand you'd like to inquire about one of our vintages." Yes, Diana answered, maintaining her calm tone. The Bordeaux from the lamb course. It was exceptional. I'd love to purchase a bottle if possible. Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. Ah, yes. That particular bottle is a very rare vintage. It retails for roughly $300, though I'm not sure we have any remaining stock for retail. Diana didn't blink. That price seems fair. Victor tilted his head, expression tightening. The Arlington is not a retail wine merchant. Madam, we curate our selections for in-house dining. Guests usually appreciate the exclusivity. I do, she replied evenly. But I also believe great wine should be remembered. There was a pause. Victor's eyes flicked toward the senator's table, then back. Madam, he said again, the word practically a dismissal now. Perhaps another establishment could better suit your preferences. We can recommend several options with a more accessible selection. The word hung there, accessible, deliberate, insulting. Diana gave a small, measured smile. Thank you for the suggestion, but no need. I've had what I came for. Victor gave a stiff nod, already beginning to turn away when her voice stopped him. Actually, she said, her voice suddenly lower, more pointed. There's one more thing. Victor turned back. Yes, how long have you been managing the Arlington? There was a flicker in his eyes, uncertainty, but he recovered quickly. 5 years, he said confidently. I was hand-selected by Mr. Blackwood himself. Diana nodded, filing the lie away. I see. Thank you. Mr. Remington, that will be all. Victor retreated, his pace brisker now, his shoulders stiffer. Diana reached into her purse and placed her black credit card on the tray. She didn't need to say anything more. The conversation had told her everything. As he vanished into the dining room haze, Diana reached for her phone and made a discreet note. Her expression was unreadable, but beneath her calm exterior was a flurry of calculations, names, behaviors, inconsistencies. The Arlington didn't need a new menu or new flatware. It needed a new soul. After settling the bill, she flagged down a passing busser young, barely 20, with flushed cheeks and a startled expression. Excuse me, she said softly. When does your shift end tonight? He blinked. Kitchen closes at 11. Ma'am, we're usually out by 11:30. She smiled kindly. Thank you. Outside, the night had cooled even more. Diana stepped out onto the front steps of the Arlington, the valet hustling to retrieve a sleek black car for a guest who'd barely looked up from his phone. Her own taxi was long gone, but she wasn't in a rush. Instead of calling another, she crossed the street to a small cafe that was just beginning its final hour. Inside, she ordered a black coffee, no cream, no sugar, and claimed a window seat with a perfect view of the restaurant's glowing sign. From her handbag, she withdrew a leather-bound notebook and began writing notes, observations, thoughts about each course, each server, each moment. She wasn't just preparing to take over, she was preparing for surgery. Hours passed. At precisely 11:05 p.m. She looked up just in time to see a side door of the Arlington swing open. One by one, the kitchen staff began to file out, tired, jackets unbuttoned, laughter. Tentative, she recognized Ryan immediately, followed by Melissa, then 2 others she'd seen floating in the background all night. Diana packed up her things and approached them slowly. Ryan spotted her first. Ms. Winters, I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I wanted to thank you for your service tonight. And if you all aren't in a rush, I'd love to buy you a drink. There was a pause, confusion, then curiosity. Melissa looked at the others. Why, she asked, not unkindly. Why would you want to do that? Diana smiled. Let's just say I had an eye-opening evening, and I think there's more to this place than what's listed on the menu. They hesitated, but the offer of drinks and perhaps something more intangible, like being seen, was enough to sway them. 20 minutes later, they were seated in a booth at a nearby pub. A round of simple cocktails in front of them. Gone were the crisp uniforms. Ryan wore a t-shirt with a faded logo. Melissa had pulled her hair into a loose bun. They looked younger, freer, more human. So, Diana began, "How long has each of you worked at the Arlington? 5 years. Ryan said, 3 for me. Melissa added, 7, said Jorge. A cook with calloused hands and tired eyes. A year and some change, Alicia murmured. Diana nodded, sipping her drink. And before that, what drew you to it? There was a pause. And then Jorge answered, it used to be the kind of place people were proud to work at. Mr. Blackwood, he was old school, but he cared, remembered everyone's name, asked about our families. Now it's different how she asked. Gently, Ryan leaned in. Victor, ever since he took over, it's all about image. He cuts corners, prioritizes tables with names he recognizes. If you look like money, you're golden. If not, you're disposable. Does Mr. Blackwood know? Diana asked, feigning ignorancy. Blackwood's been sick for a while. Melissa said, barely showed up the past year. Victor ran the show, said he was chosen to carry on the legacy. Diana tilted her glass slowly, watching the amber liquid swirl. Interesting. And yet I've heard different stories. They looked at her, brows furrowing. What do you mean? Ryan asked. Let's just say, Diana said softly, I have a vested interest in the future of the Arlington. And tonight, you all gave me a lot of clarity. She let the words hang there, just enough truth to spark intrigue, but not enough to reveal everything. Not yet. As the group dispersed, she thanked them sincerely, left cash on the table to cover drinks, and watched them walk back into the night, laughing a little more freely than when they had arrived. Diana pulled out her phone one last time. Martin, she said when her attorney picked up, we're moving up the timeline. I want to announce the transition tomorrow. I don't care if it's early. A pause. Yes, she confirmed. I'm sure. She ended the call and looked back toward the now dark Arlington across the street. The next time she walked through those doors, it wouldn't be as a silent observer. It would be as the woman in charge. Dawn filtered softly through the tall windows of Diana's home office, turning stacks of papers and neatly organized folders into golden monuments of preparation. She had barely slept. Instead, she'd spent most of the night surrounded by the documentation Edward Blackwood's legal team had discreetly handed over weeks ago: staff records, supplier contracts, maintenance logs, and, most importantly, 5 years' worth of financial statements. She didn't need to go digging to find the problem. The discrepancies surfaced like oil on water. There were subtle patterns at first, minor vendor markups that didn't align with standard pricing trends, inconsistencies between purchase orders and actual inventory usage. Diana had been consulting for restaurants long enough to know that errors happened, but these weren't errors. They were systems. Someone had designed them. She sipped the now cold remnants of her second coffee, her eyes scanning one last spreadsheet. There it was again, a shadow transaction from a boutique wine distributor. With no matching invoice, it mirrored the story Ryan had hinted at the night before. High-value wines, sold under the table, cash unaccounted for, skimming, theft, elegant and quiet. Like everything else Victor Remington seemed to do. Her phone buzzed, Ryan's name flashing across the screen. Ms. Winters. His voice was cautious, uncertain. Good morning, Ryan, she said. Thank you for calling back. I got your message, but I'm not sure I understood what you meant last night. Are you, investigating something? Diana didn't answer right away. She leaned back in her chair, letting the silence stretch just enough to signal seriousness. I believe there are some irregularities in the Arlington's operations, she said carefully, and I think you're in a position to help me understand them. I don't know. He hesitated. I'm just a server. You're observant, she replied. You've been there for years. You see more than you think. And I promise you any conversation we have will remain between us. Ryan hesitated again. Then his voice dropped. There's a second ledger. Victor keeps it in his office. He tells us to route certain transactions through it, mostly wine sales, especially when guests pay in cash, the big bottles, rare vintages. Diana's pulse didn't quicken. She didn't let it. Do you have access to that ledger? Oh, Ryan said. But Melissa might. She helps him with admin stuff sometimes. She mentioned once that the numbers didn't make sense. Can you ask her to speak with me? Diana asked. Someplace quiet. I'll try, he said. But if Victor finds out, he won't, Diana assured him. And after tomorrow, he won't have the authority to make you afraid anymore. She ended the call and pulled out her notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote Melissa, access to records, wine sales, off-book system, vendor markup, recurring, staff turnover, motivation, culture of fear, leadership style. By midday, she was sitting across from Melissa in a corner booth of a quiet brunch cafe 3 blocks from the restaurant. The young woman looked nervous, her fingers tightly clasped around her mug of herbal tea. I don't want to get fired, Melissa said softly. I need this job. You're not getting fired, Diana said, not for telling the truth. Melissa pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and slid it across the table. Then Diana looked down to see a gallery of screenshots, PDF exports from a system clearly not part of the official POS software, orders for wines not listed in the main sales records, duplicate entries, deleted transactions. There's more, Melissa said. He sometimes tells us to report higher spoilage rates on inventory, especially on expensive ingredients. Then he bills the supplier for a reshipment and pockets the extra. I overheard him once talking to the fish vendor on speaker by accident. They've got some kind of kickback deal. Diana felt the weight of the information settle heavily. Not with shock, but with confirmation. Everything she'd suspected was true, if not worse. And no one's reported this, she asked. Melissa shook her head. He's got friends in the group that manages the property. Everyone knows it. 2 people tried to file complaints a year ago. They were both let go within a week. One of them couldn't even get a reference afterward. That was all Diana needed to hear. By late afternoon, she'd spoken to 3 more staff members, each in separate meetings arranged discreetly by Ryan. One was Jorge, the line cook, who described how ingredient quality had gradually declined under Victor's direction. He started swapping out the truffle supplier for cheaper oil 2 years ago. Jorge said no one would notice, but I noticed. The regulars noticed. We used to have chefs come just to taste our risottos. Not anymore. Another conversation took her across town to a wine boutique where Thomas, the head sommelier, had agreed to meet. He arrived in plain clothes, sunglasses tucked into the collar of his shirt, and carried a small USB stick inside an envelope. I don't want this to become a scandal, he said quietly, but I was close with Edward. This isn't what he wanted. Diana took the USB without a word. They didn't need to exchange pleasantries. The gravity was already understood. By evening, her office was quiet again, save for the soft hum of her laptop as she loaded the contents of the drive. There were spreadsheets, emails, transaction reports, and most damning screenshots of internal memos between Victor and a procurement contact discussing markup tolerance ranges. This wasn't carelessness. This was orchestration. She didn't need any more confirmation. She called Martin. I need an emergency staff meeting at the Arlington tomorrow morning. Before opening, I want every department head and representative from the restaurant group there. Can you make that happen? You have the authority now, Martin replied. I'll be there with the paperwork. Good, she said, and arrange for security. Quietly, I want them present, but not visible, not unless they're needed. The next morning, the Arlington opened its doors not to diners, but to staff shuffling in with confused expressions and sleep still clinging to their eyes. The main dining room had been cleared of settings, chairs rearranged into a wide semicircle around a long table. At the head of that table stood Diana, dressed not in the soft tones of observation, but in a sharp navy suit with steel buttons and a single emerald brooch at her lapel. Martin stood beside her, holding a leather portfolio. Victor was already there, his brow furrowed, glancing at his watch like he was being inconvenienced by his own kingdom. Excuse me, he called out to the room, loud and authoritative. Who authorized this? Dana stepped forward. I did. His eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you? She met his gaze. Dana Winters. As of 3 weeks ago. I'm the new owner of the Arlington. The room went still. The silence was immediate and all-consuming. Staff exchanged shocked glances. A busser nearly dropped the tray he had been carrying. Victor's face paled, but he recovered quickly, too quickly. That's impossible, he said. The Arlington is managed by the consortium. The consortium was part of the previous agreement. Martin interrupted smoothly, producing a copy of the finalized sale documents. Miss Winters acquired the restaurant directly through Edward Blackwood's estate. You were notified of the ownership change 2 days ago. Victor, I thought it was a mistake. Victor snapped. Some formality. It wasn't, Diana said. Her voice was firm, calm, and I spent the last 2 days reviewing your work. She turned to the gathered staff. I wanted to see how this place ran without anyone knowing who I was. What I saw, and what I learned from your colleagues, boss, was deeply disappointing. Victor's smile cracked. With all due respect, there's evidence. Diana said, financial discrepancies, shadow accounts, off-the-book wine sales, vendor fraud, intimidation tactics. She gestured to Martin, who began to hand out documents, screenshots, invoices, testimonies, all printed and ready. This is defamation, Victor said, his voice rising with desperation. You can't just, you're done, Diana said. Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. Security will escort you from the premises. 2 men in dark suits appeared from the edge of the room. Victor's eyes darted around, looking for allies, finding none. His gaze finally landed on Diana, bitter and trembling. You set me up, he accused. You walked in here in that dress and acted like what? Victor, Diana said quietly. Someone beneath your standards, someone not worth your time. That wasn't a setup. That was your reflection. He was silent as the guards moved toward him. To everyone else, she said, turning to the room, this is a new beginning. We're going back to Edward's vision. We're going back to respect. As Victor was led out, the silence broke not with applause, not yet, but with something far more powerful relief, the kind that came when fear left the room. Victor's departure from the Arlington wasn't theatrical in the way he had often imagined himself in tailored suits and curated applause, but swift and quiet, escorted by 2 security officers who moved with the precision of people used to ending things. No dramatic protest, no last-minute plea, just the sound of expensive shoes scuffing across polished floors and a door closing behind him. The dining room remained still for a long moment after. Like the building itself had exhaled, Diana remained motionless at the center of the room, letting the silence speak before she did. I know this is a lot, she finally said, her voice steady but not cold. For many of you, Victor has been the only leader you've known here. I also know that some of you have stayed despite him. You've stayed because you care about the food, about the experience, about this place. Eyes met hers across the circle, Melissa's cautious gaze, Ryan's wary but curious one, Jorge's tired but alert face, Alicia standing near the edge of the crowd, half convinced it was still all a trick. I'm not here to erase your work, Diana continued. I'm here to protect it, to protect you. This restaurant was built with integrity, and that legacy doesn't end with one man's corruption. It begins again with us. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the space. The morning light filtered through the windows now, making the brass light fixtures shimmer like they were waking up too. We'll need to rebuild some things, she said. Trust, culture, transparency. But that doesn't mean starting from scratch. It means starting from truth. The staff stood quietly, taking it in. Diana could feel the undercurrent of disbelief still pulsing beneath the surface. Trust wasn't earned with speeches. It would take time, consistency, but this was the beginning. She turned to Martin and nodded. He stepped forward with a folder and began explaining the immediate changes: temporary leadership restructuring, an anonymous feedback channel for staff concerns, an external audit to clean up the books. But as he spoke, Diana stepped away. Her part in that moment was done. Now she needed to reconnect, not command. She moved to the side, where Ryan lingered with a few other servers. Uncertainty still etched in his features. Ryan, she said, softly enough that only he could hear, would you be willing to walk me through the service flow later today? I'd like to see it from your eyes. His brows lifted. You want me to show you how we work? Exactly, she said. From prep to final plate. Yeah, he said slowly, surprise melting into something softer. Of course, nearby, Melissa stepped forward. Miss Winters, please. Diana smiled. Call me Diana. I wanted to say thank you, Melissa said, not just for what happened today, but for asking, for listening. Nobody ever really asks. That's going to change. Diana said, but I'll need your help to make sure it does. A little after noon, Diana met with the kitchen team in the back prep area. She hadn't announced her visit ahead of time. Instead, she walked through the swinging doors in a crisp white shirt, hair tied back, no makeup. She wasn't there to impress anyone, just to understand. Chef Paul Harrington was already in motion, barking instructions at the line cooks, overseeing chopping stations, checking delivery slips. His presence was quieter than Victor's, but far more commanding. He didn't need to speak loudly to be respected. When he spotted Diana, his face didn't shift. He just raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you'd come back here so soon, he said. I spent most of my life in kitchens, she replied. This is where I feel most at home. Paul gave a small nod. It's not what it used to be. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. She moved to a nearby counter and rolled up her sleeves. Show me what's changed. Over the next 2 hours, Diana moved through the back of the house like a second set of eyes, not to oversee, but to learn. She tasted sauces, smelled produce, ran her fingers along the steel prep tables. It was all clean, efficient, but something was missing. It's muscle memory now, Paul muttered, handing her a sliver of roasted duck from the test pan. No spark. We used to talk about food here, not just execute. Victor didn't value creativity, Diana said. He valued numbers. Paul replied, an intimidation. Did you ever confront him? I tried. Paul said, once. He said passion doesn't pay rent. Diana nodded, chewing slowly. Well, that ends today. She pulled a notebook from her back pocket and opened it. We're going to reintroduce weekly culinary sessions, tastings, supplier visits, ideation meetings. I want your voice back in this kitchen, Paul, and not just yours. I want everyone's. You sure they're ready for that, he asked. I don't know, Diana said, but I'm sure they deserve the chance. Later that afternoon, she walked the dining floor with Melissa, noting which tables had water rings from decades of use, which carpets needed rethreading, which chandeliers had bulbs that flickered slightly under the wrong voltage. She didn't need flash or opulence, but she needed the space to reflect care. As they passed the wine wall, Thomas, the head sommelier, approached with a clipboard. He looked different today, more relaxed, less guarded. I reorganized the cellar this morning, he said, and flagged the vintages that were part of Victor's under-the-table scheme. Thank you, Diana said. How bad was it? Pretty bad, he replied. Some of those bottles haven't been legally logged in over a year. I want every bottle inventoried, she said. I want receipts. And when you're done with that, I want to schedule a wine education series for staff, not just sommeliers, hosts, bussers, anyone who wants to learn. Thomas looked up, startled. You want everyone trained? I want knowledge shared, she replied. Wine shouldn't be a weapon of class. It should be a shared language. He smiled for the first time. Edward would have liked you. I hope so, she said softly. He saw something in me. Now I have to live up to it. By the time the sun dipped beneath the skyline, the Arlington wasn't yet transformed, but it was awake. Staff moved differently now, less stiff, more curious. There was a sense of watching, yes, but also a sense of being watched over, rather than policed. Before she left for the evening, Diana sat alone in the main dining room, now empty and quiet again. The same table where she'd once been placed as the overlooked guest still stood near the kitchen doors. She approached it and sat, this time not as a test, but as a memory. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small black and white photograph, her first restaurant kitchen job. She was 19, smiling in a borrowed apron, Her hair tied with a shoelace, she laid the photo on the table and whispered, "We're just getting started." In the distance, the hum of the refrigerator units and the faint sound of knives being cleaned was the only music left. It was the beginning of something honest, something built not from fear or reputation, but from purpose. And Diana Winters, once the woman no one saw, was now the one reshaping everything they thought they understood about power, leadership, and what it meant to truly own a legacy. The next morning came quietly, but with a sense of anticipation that buzzed through the Arlington like static before a storm. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was no fog of dread hanging over the staff as they arrived. Instead, there was something else, something new and unfamiliar, possibility. Diana arrived early, well before the doors opened, dressed not in corporate armor, but in soft slate slacks and a crisp, collarless blouse. It wasn't a power move, it was a declaration she was here to work, not perform. As she stepped into the building, the warmth of the kitchen's early prep hum met her like an old friend. She took a moment to stand in the empty front of house and listen to the chopping from the back, the clink of cutlery being reset, the low murmur of the espresso machine warming up. It was the heartbeat of the restaurant, and it was starting to pulse again. She walked the floor slowly, stopping to nod at Jorge in the kitchen, who acknowledged her with a slight wave of his chef's knife before returning to his brunoise carrots. Melissa was at the host stand, reviewing the reservation list for the evening, her face a mix of focus and cautious optimism. Diana joined her. "Busy night?" she asked. Melissa glanced up. "We're half booked so far. Some regulars canceled when they heard about the transition." Diana nodded. "Let them. We're not chasing prestige. We're building it the right way." Melissa looked relieved to hear it, as if she'd been waiting to exhale. Downstairs, in a small storage room that had once served as Victor's private wine cove, a place no one but he was allowed to access, Thomas had spent the past 2 days cataloging every bottle, every receipt, every missing invoice. He greeted Diana at the door, still holding a clipboard dusted with cellar grime. "I've finished the audit," he said without preamble. "I've highlighted everything suspicious in red." "There's a lot of red." Diana stepped inside. The cellar wasn't lavish, but it was methodical. Shelves of vintage wines stood like soldiers in ranks. She studied the marked files, flipping slowly through a binder. "How much do you think was siphoned off?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Conservatively, 50,000. More, if you factor in undocumented cash. And we've confirmed it with vendor statements. Double-checked yesterday. Some of them were clearly in on it, though they're pretending otherwise now." "Have Martin initiate breach of contract notices," she said. "We'll take our business elsewhere. No more backroom loyalty to suppliers who compromise our values." Thomas smiled faintly. "You say things people think but never dare say." "I've had 25 years to practice," she replied. By midday, she'd convened a smaller meeting in the upstairs lounge originally built as a VIP space, now repurposed as an idea lab. Around the table were representatives from every department: kitchen, front of house, bar, sommelier, admin. The mood was subdued but attentive. "I want to start a new tradition," Diana said. "Every Thursday afternoon, we'll meet here, not to issue orders, but to collaborate, bring ideas, bring complaints, bring wild suggestions. You all see things I don't. You know this place better than any outsider ever could." Jorge cleared his throat. "What if the ideas challenge what's always been done?" Diana smiled. "Good. If something doesn't survive questioning, it probably doesn't deserve to." Alicia, the soft-spoken junior server who had barely said a word the past few days, looked up. "Can we talk about the uniforms?" That drew a few surprised looks. Diana leaned forward. "What about them? They're stiff," Alicia said. "They don't fit right. And the women's jackets are cut like they're designed for mannequins, not humans. It's hard to carry trays without pinching. I'll bring in a tailor," Diana said immediately. "Not just to redesign, to listen. Everyone deserves to move comfortably while doing their job." The staff seemed stunned by how quickly the answer came. But Diana wasn't posturing, she meant it, because small things built big culture. Later that afternoon, Ryan met her by the espresso bar. where he was training a new hire, a college student with nervous hands and eyes that kept darting to the schedule posted on the back wall. New blood, Diana asked. Yeah, Ryan said. He's green, but willing. Then that's all that matters. Train him with grace. As the day wound down, Diana returned to her office, a space Victor had claimed as his private sanctum. She had spent the previous evening tearing it apart, both literally and symbolically. Gone were the dark leather chairs, the smug black and gold decor, the oversized ego posters. In their place were open shelves, a simple wood desk, and two guest chairs facing her. Not the wall. She sat and reviewed the feedback folder Melissa had compiled. Staff had begun submitting anonymous comments, and already the tone had shifted from fear to curiosity. Can we source from the farmer's market again? Could we switch our dishwashers to an eco-friendly detergent? Would it be possible to hold language classes for non-native English speakers on staff? Yes, and absolutely yes. The ideas came faster than she could organize them. But that was the point. A healthy organism doesn't grow in silence, it buzzes with motion. That night, Diana stayed past closing, not as an act of martyrdom, but because she couldn't bear to leave just yet. The Arlington had never been a job to her. It had always been something more. A symbol, a wound, a dream. She walked the main dining floor in her bare feet, heels tucked into one hand. The tables were set for the next day. The silverware glinted beneath the moonlight streaming through the front windows. She approached one of the window-side booths, Victor's favorite to reserve for the ultra-wealthy, and sat, pulling out her notebook. She wrote a single line across a fresh page. How do we measure dignity in a space designed for exclusivity? She let the question sit. It was more than philosophy, it was design. It was policy. It was wine pairings and greetings and who gets the corner table. After a few minutes, she turned to the next page and began sketching the framework for a new guest protocol, one that included sensitivity training for staff, one that ensured no guest would be judged by their clothes or dining alone, one that made room for solo diners with a view, not a corner. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Melissa peeked in. Sorry it's late. I didn't want to leave without saying goodnight. Diana smiled. Thank you for stopping by. Melissa hesitated, then said, I overheard a table say something earlier. They were regulars. Said the place feels different already. Different good or different strange? Melissa laughed. They said it felt lighter, like the walls could breathe again. Diana closed her notebook and stood. Then we're on the right track. As Melissa left, Diana turned off the last light herself. She walked through the front doors and onto the sidewalk, pausing under the same awning where just a few nights ago she had been humiliated, dismissed, labeled not one of them. Now, the street was silent, but inside, a new story had begun, not one of revenge, but of reclamation. 2 weeks had passed since Victor had been escorted from the Arlington, but the memory of his rule still lingered like the aftertaste of a poorly paired wine. It lingered in the glances exchanged between longtime staff members when a guest complained, in the hesitation that hovered just before a suggestion was spoken aloud, in the quiet way the younger employees still asked for permission they no longer needed. Diana could see it, hear it, feel it beneath the surface of every smile. But something else was emerging too. There was laughter in the kitchen now, laughter that wasn't forced or anxious. There was music again. Quiet jazz, indie playlists, even a Spanish pop song that Jorge swore made his knife work faster. Melissa had started wearing her hair down. Alicia no longer flinched when asked her opinion. Ryan had stopped checking over his shoulder when he explained a dish with too much passion. And Diana, she had finally allowed herself to breathe. Still, she knew the hardest part wasn't over. The culture of fear might have been broken, but the culture of complacency of silence was far more insidious. That was the part that needed rooting out, not just for the staff, for the guests too. And so, she planned something drastic. It started with an invitation, hand-delivered, minimalist, embossed in simple cream stock. You are cordially invited to an evening at the Arlington, a celebration of legacy, transformation, and the people who keep the soul of this restaurant alive. One night only. She sent 20, only 20, 10 to long-standing regulars. including some who had quietly canceled after Victor's departure, 5 to former employees who had left during his reign, 3 to local food journalists she trusted, and 2, just 2 to strangers, people who had once been turned away at the door. Diana didn't want a PR spectacle. She wanted a reckoning, a mirror. The night arrived with a rare summer rain that tapped gently against the windows, blurring the skyline into impressionist strokes. Inside, the restaurant had been transformed, not by chandeliers or florals or plated excess, but by light, warm, ambient, candle soft. Every table was draped in linen, the color of parchment. The menus, printed on recycled craft paper, listed dishes that traced the evolution of the Arlington from Edward's earliest creations to the innovations of the current team. Diana stood near the entrance, not waiting like Victor once had to perform a welcome, but simply watching, observing. As the guests began to arrive, she noticed the reactions. Senator Williams entered first, looking puzzled, perhaps even skeptical. His last visit had ended in thunderous laughter over vintage champagne. Tonight, he was greeted not with theatrics, but by Melissa, who welcomed him with a genuine smile and walked him to a table not at the center of attention, but nestled beside a large window. A few of the former regulars followed, one of whom blinked as he recognized Jorge from the kitchen, now walking through the dining room in a crisp new apron, personally delivering small amuse-bouche with a quiet pride Diana hadn't seen before. Then came the woman in the red raincoat. Diana watched her hesitate at the door. She had been one of the 2 strangers, though not really a stranger at all. Her story had reached Diana through Ryan, a middle-aged black woman who had once shown up without a reservation, dressed modestly, and been told by Victor that the Arlington was at capacity despite half the tables sitting empty. She had left without making a scene, just vanished. Tonight, she stepped inside carefully, as if bracing for something. And Melissa greeted her like an old friend. "Welcome. We're so glad you're here," Diana smiled. Dinner began not with a speech, but with silence. A server placed a note on each table. A single quote from Edward Blackwood: "Hospitality is not performance, it is presence." The meal that followed was a symphony of stories, each course paired not just with wine, but with narrative. Before the second course, Ryan spoke briefly about the supplier who grew the herbs. Before the third, Alicia described how she and Paul had reworked the risotto to return to Edward's original flavor, memory lemon zest, not truffle oil. For the 5th course, Jorge emerged again, apron still dusted with flour, to explain the inspiration behind the short rib stew, a homage to his grandmother in Oaxaca. The guests listened, ate, and slowly, the room changed. Conversation grew louder but not boisterous, genuine. Questions were asked, memories shared. The woman in the red raincoat asked for a second serving of the house-made bread. The senator actually leaned over to compliment the server. One former employee, seated quietly at the back, wiped away tears during dessert. Diana had been standing at the edge of the dining room, quietly checking every plate, every corner of the experience. When she noticed Victor's old table, it was empty, not reserved, not forgotten, just left intentionally untouched. She walked toward it, sat alone, and watched. When the final course was served, a simple pear tart with lavender cream and honey from a nearby rooftop hive, Melissa approached her, hesitant. "Someone asked to speak with you," she said. Diana nodded. Of course, it was the woman in the raincoat. She stood just off to the side, unsure of how much space to take up. Diana stood to greet her. "Thank you for coming." The woman smiled slowly. "I wasn't sure I should. I thought maybe I wasn't really invited." "You were," Diana said, intentionally. The woman hesitated, then said softly, "I came here once, a year ago. I walked through those doors, and it felt like I'd wandered into a room that wasn't meant for me." "I know," Diana said. "I saw it happen, to you, and to others. I didn't make a scene." The woman continued, voice steady. "I just left, but I thought about it for a long time, about what it said about me, about places like this." Diana didn't interrupt. "But tonight," the woman said, "you let people like me be part of the story, not just served, But see now, you were always part of it. Diana said, they just didn't write you in. The woman blinked fast. Thank you. Diana watched as she turned and walked back to her table, where her dessert waited patiently, untouched. It wasn't just sweetness that made a dish linger on the tongue, it was truth. Later that evening, after the last glass had been cleared and the rain had softened into mist, Diana gathered the staff together in the lounge. No speeches, no fanfare, just tired bodies and buzzing hearts. Ryan spoke first. That didn't feel like a shift. It felt like a shift back to something we forgot was possible. Melissa added. Paul shrugged. Hell of a service. And we didn't even burn anything. Everyone laughed. Diana waited, then said, quietly, we're not done. Not even close. But tonight, you reminded the city who we are. Not who we were under Victor. Who we are. And we did it without belittling anyone, without elitism, without exclusion. She paused, then added, we served dignity tonight, and they tasted it. There were no applause, just the kind of silence that follows something sacred. And as she turned out the lights, one by one, Diana glanced back at the dining room, the empty chairs, the glowing table candles. The small notes folded next to dessert plates. Legacy wasn't just something you inherited, it was something you rebuilt, bite by bite, voice by voice. And finally, the Arlington wasn't haunted anymore. It was alive. The morning after the event, the Arlington rested in a rare kind of stillness, not from exhaustion, but from the kind of quiet that comes after something profound. A reset. Diana arrived just as the light crept in through the tall windows, painting golden lines across the tabletops and the newly polished floors. The dining room smelled faintly of beeswax and citrus oil, remnants of the night before. Every chair was back in place, every table reset with precision, but something intangible had changed. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a statement. She moved through the space without haste, fingertips grazing the back of a chair, her shoes echoing gently against the hardwood. Last night's tasting event had not gone viral. There were no influencers live streaming foie gras or champagne, but something more valuable had happened. The diners had gone home talking, and not just about the food. They talked about Jorge's story, about Alicia's smile, about the way the staff had spoken of ingredients like poetry. And most of all, they talked about how something in them had shifted, how, for the first time in a long time, dining hadn't felt like performance or status. It had felt like belonging. In the office, Melissa was already sorting through a growing pile of handwritten comment cards. She looked up as Diana entered, her face still flushed with the residual adrenaline of the previous night. 36 written responses. She said, holding up the stack like a trophy, no one does that anymore. Diana smiled. Let me guess, no one asked for a refund. Just seconds. Melissa grinned. They laughed. The sound light and unguarded, but Diana knew the work wasn't over. One successful night couldn't erase years of systemic elitism. What Victor had built had been efficient. Yes, but it had also been a machine that sorted people by perceived worth. And those mechanisms didn't vanish just because their architect had been removed. She walked to the large corkboard they'd placed in the break room, a makeshift wall of ideas submitted anonymously by staff. Some were small. Can we change the coffee supplier? Others were bolder. What if we did a pay-what-you-can night once a month, but one note, scribbled in slanted handwriting and pinned in the center? Stopped her. What if we became the restaurant that teaches people what dignity tastes like? She didn't know who had written it, but she knew it would become their North Star. That afternoon, she met with the new leadership team in the same upstairs lounge that had hosted the collaborative tastings. Paul, Ryan, Melissa, Jorge, Alicia, and Thomas now formed a kind of unofficial council, each representing different voices within the restaurant. They sat around a long wooden table that once served as a backdrop for high-end wine tastings. Today, it bore no silverware. Just notebooks, shared coffee, and one collective question. What next? Diana opened with a simple truth. We've changed the narrative in here, But the world out there still sees us as what we used to be. So we have a choice. We either try to win them back with old tricks, or we show them who we really are now. Ryan leaned forward. Then we have to open the doors wider, not just in policy, but in message. Agreed, Melissa said. But we also need boundaries. It can't become a free-for-all. Dignity goes both ways. We respect guests, but we expect respect in return. Paul nodded. So we write it into the experience. Let people know this isn't about exclusivity, it's about excellence. Shared, not hoarded. They brainstormed for hours. Ideas poured out community cooking classes led by the kitchen staff profit-sharing programs, a rotating guest chef night that would spotlight cooks from underrepresented backgrounds. But what struck Diana most wasn't the creativity, it was the hunger, the desire to mean something again, to matter beyond Michelin stars or food blogs. By early evening, the decision had been made the Arlington would host its first ever Open Table Week, a 7-day stretch where diners could make pay-what-you-can reservations for lunch services. No ID checks, no income verification, just food. The same service. One condition: you had to sit at community tables. No isolated booths, no corner seats for the important. Everyone would dine side by side. The announcement went out that night, posted on their modest website and quietly shared through email lists and whispered word of mouth. No press release, no influencers tagged, just an open invitation. By the second day of Open Table Week, the reservations were full and the magic began again. A man in a maintenance uniform sat beside a city councilwoman. A pair of college students shared a meal with a retired librarian who hadn't eaten out in years. A single mother with 2 kids came in wearing their Sunday best, not because they were told to, but because it felt like an occasion. The kitchen served the same dishes, the same wine, the same warmth, and slowly, the walls around perception began to dissolve. Diana moved through it all like a conductor not always seen, but always aware. Somehow, she spotted a woman quietly weeping over dessert, only to smile moments later when a stranger passed her the bread basket. She noticed Ryan kneel beside a boy too shy to order, letting him pick his meal from a set of photos on a tablet. She watched Jorge send out a special plate to a young man celebrating his first job, adding a chocolate drizzle that simply read, "Welcome to the journey." On the final night of the week, Diana sat at one of the community tables herself. No press, no announcement, just a seat between an elderly couple and a teenager who had taken the bus 3 neighborhoods over just to try the Arlington while it was still open to regular people. She turned to him and smiled. "We're always open to regular people." He blinked, not recognizing her. "Really? Even after this weekend's, especially after," she said, when the meal ended and guests began to leave. Several stopped to thank the staff, not in the performative way wealthy patrons sometimes did, but with sincerity, with eye contact, with gratitude that went beyond service. Inside the break room, later that night, the staff was buzzing, not from exhaustion, but from a feeling none of them had words for: purpose, redemption, joy. Diana stood near the corkboard again, where new notes had begun to appear. "My brother cried eating that risotto. He said it tasted like our dad's. I didn't know you could feel safe in a restaurant like this. I used to work here. I didn't know it could feel like this." She turned to the group. "We did something this week that's going to outlive the food," she said. "We reminded people and maybe ourselves that greatness doesn't have to exclude, that taste, style, and elegance don't belong to the rich. They belong to anyone who's willing to show up with heart." She paused. "There will be resistance. There will be people who say this isn't sustainable, that we'll go broke serving kindness, but they're wrong, because kindness scales, dignity scales. People return to places that make them feel seen." The room was quiet, then Alicia spoke. Her voice small but clear. "Victor used to say, the guest is always right, but the rich guest is righter." Diana laughed softly. "Well, now the guest is human, period." One by one, the team returned to their duties, cleaning, resetting, readying for another day. But the space they left behind was more than a break room now. It was a command center for a revolution, quiet, elegant, unstoppable. As Diana stood alone at the front doors, ready to turn the lock, she looked out into the night. The rain had come again. Misting the sidewalks with silver, she stepped outside, letting it touch her face. The woman in the beige dress had walked in weeks ago to test a place. Now, the woman in the navy coat stood beneath the awning. Having transformed it, she did not need a title. She didn't need revenge. She had something better. She had changed what people thought power looked like. She had made the Arlington honest. And that honesty, now, would feed more than mouths. It would feed memory. It would feed meaning. It would last.